Just double check, Tim has outlines. If anyone doesn't have one, it will help as we go through tonight. I was telling Tim earlier, in this type of weather, we had farms 10 to 15 miles away from our house that had cattle in them. There would be small stock ponds, and this time of year we had to get to our cattle, both to feed them, but if the ponds ever iced over, we always had an axe with us, and we would cut these squares along the edge and slide the ice toward the middle, because if you don't, then the herd can get out on the ice and fall through and drown. And the older cows will learn if you broke the ice, they can come back with their feet and break it. But we've cut ice this thick sometimes and slid it under. My granddad always says, if we've got 50 cows and 10 show up, make sure the 10 get well fed. So for those of you here tonight, I hope you get well fed before we leave. Tonight we're looking at kind of the final part of this 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, and that to me is such a significant thing for us to remember. I mean, it's easy for us to turn a page and then just stop and think, okay, how different, totally different things are. And as we said initially, I think for us, you think how different is the United States from 1776 to 1976 for our bicentennial, and then you have to wonder if Jesus hasn't come back, and if there's a United States 400 years later, how different is that country going to look than the colonies of 1776? And I think that's a really helpful kind of space reminder for us to have, because when we turn those pages, then the main symbol that we have used, the image, is the dream that God gives to Nebuchadnezzar. And he starts with the Babylonians as the head of gold, and then the chest is going to be made of silver. This is going to be the Medes and the Persians. And then we're going to have the thighs and the upper legs made of bronze. And then here come the feet and the legs, and they're going to be iron, and then the feet are partly iron and partly clay. And it's very significant in the days of those kings, the Romans, God is going to establish a kingdom which will never be shaken. And this is something that is very important, because national kingdoms have and will rise and fall. But this spiritual kingdom that we're a part of is something that's going to last forever. What we've chosen to do tonight, though, is we're going to back up a little bit briefly into the time of the Greeks, and we want to just look at the Jews, because we have a totally different picture of Judaism and Jews when we come to the opening of our New Testament than we had when we finish up with the Old Testament. So we have one central idea tonight, and we're going to see briefly 5, but mainly 4 Jewish groups, Jewish sects. We're most familiar with the Pharisees, and we'll explain why as we go through. Then the Sadducees are a much smaller group, but they're a very wealthy financial group, and there's a lot of give and take and competition between the two. There's a group, and Simon the Zealot is going to be one of our apostles, and these are going to be virtually a spiritual guerrilla warfare. God's going to conquer by the sword, and they're a very militant group. And then, and please don't be offended, I don't ever intend this to be offended, but I call the Essenes the homeschool movement. And I empathize with people. There's some people who feel like, I don't want my kids in public school. I support whatever parents want to do, okay? And if parents want to do that, I will totally back them. My preference is I wanted my children to be salt, light, and leaven. I wanted my son in a class where they taught evolution. Luke, I can't tell you evolution without laughing. And if you're going to be able to talk to your peers for the rest of your life, you need to really be able to understand this, because truth has nothing to hide from. And I want you to know the science part inside and out so that you can explain to people and see, who was Moses? He was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Who is Daniel? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Oh, they graduate top of their class with Babylonian theology and gods. And so there are choices that people have to make. So for those who choose to do that, I don't have any problem with that. I'm just saying there's choices that people make. So the Essenes are going to say there is so much worldliness, there's so much sin around us, we're going to just leave society. And probably are the people who are at the Dead Sea, and we'll talk about those in a second. So here's the first question. Here's this 400 years. A major question is going to emerge. Well, what is a Jew? I mean, what is one? And even within Judaism, we're going to see a huge diversity and variety. But the other thing I want you just to kind of start thinking about, and we talked about this earlier, there's that term called the diaspora, the scattering abroad. And like, for example, recently I read a quote that said, the highest estimate of Jews that lived in the area of Palestine was 700,000, and there were over 1 million Jews that lived in Egypt. From the Elephantine, sometimes pronounced differently than that, papyri, they actually had a temple down in Egypt at one time, and there was an enormous number of Jews that lived in Egypt. Even in the book of Esther, when it comes time to send out this notice to preserve the Jews, we're going to send a notice to 127 satraps, provinces, because these Jews are just scattered everywhere. So there are going to be many, many more Jewish people living outside of Palestine than live in Palestine. Tonight we're primarily going to look at the ones within. When you look at the struggle for identity, this is number one. I just put 400. F. LaGard Smith will have Malachi a little bit earlier. That's fine, but at least by 400, the writings of the Old Testament appear to be complete. We had looked at previous Alexander the Great. He's going to be from the early 330s into the very early 320s, 10 years, and he is going to completely disperse and spread Greek culture, Greek language, and major challenges to monotheism, because the Greeks believe in many, many gods, and they have all these temples and all these things that are a part of that. After the death of Alexander, the kingdom's divided among 4 generals, and even as you will read in the book of Daniel, there are this goat and this ram, and they run into each other, and there's this big horn, and then the big horn breaks down and 4 horns come out. And then you get to thinking, okay, yes, for a decade, Alexander the Great conquered the world. He dies in that decade, and the Greek kingdom is now broken down into 4 generals. The 2 that we want to notice, first of all, from 321 to 198, Palestine is controlled by the Ptolemies. Like pneumonia has a silent P on it, then the Ptolemies is P, T-O-L-E-M-Y, and the Ptolemies are going to control Palestine initially. And let me just go ahead and mention something because it's very, very significant. In time, the city of Alexandria, which was the major city and obviously named after Alexander, but there was kind of the major academic center in the East was in Alexandria. In Australia, I went to Macquarie University, and the majority of our teachers were from Cambridge, and all of them could do the Oxford accent with great delight. And it's nice to hear a British person imitate another British person. But their explanation was, in the ancient world, Athens was the Oxford, but Alexandria was the Cambridge. At one point, there were over 700,000 scrolls in the Alexandria Library. Let me say that again. 700,000 scrolls were in the Alexandria Library. It was in many, many, many buildings, and virtually all of the writings from antiquity come to us through manuscripts at Alexandria. And this was a great place of culture and of learning. So the Ptolemies are going to control Palestine from 321 to 198. But where things start getting interesting is that Syria to the north, they're always fighting each other, and obviously Palestine is in the middle. And Syria takes over from 198 and are going to rule to 165. This is very important, and we could really do the whole lesson just on this. But his name is Antiochus Epiphanes, and you'll see this number 1 that's down there. He's a bit of an egomaniac. He is always wanting to try to spread Greek ideas and Greek culture. We mentioned this. He felt like he would slip into Egypt and take over Egypt from the Ptolemies. And to his surprise, when he gets there, the Romans are already there. And the Romans are not happy with this idea at all. And the tradition is the Roman general takes his sword out, draws a circle around Antiochus, and says, okay, before you step out of the circle, you decide if you're going to go home or if you're going to fight the Roman army. He's really frustrated. You may have heard an expression, a guy gets mad at his wife and kicks the cat, kicks the dog or something. Well, he is just really perturbed, and so on the way back, he stops in Jerusalem and he offers a sow, a pig, on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. Okay? Could you do anything to inflame Jewish blood any more than offering a pig on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem? He also then said, no more sacrifices to Yahweh, to God. There were daily sacrifices that were offered and all these other things. And so he just said, we're going to bring in Hellenism, we're going to bring in Judaism, and we're not going to have any more of these offering sacrifices to God. And as far as the Jews are concerned, the temple's unclean. I don't know that we as Gentiles have the capacity to appreciate how unclean they would feel that of all things a pig has been offered on the altar in the temple. This is going to spark what's called the Maccabean Revolt. And Mr. Maccabees and 5 sons are involved in this, and it begins an all-out guerrilla warfare. These guys are outnumbered. They're very, very brave. I forget which one of the sons it is, but they also had elephants, war elephants. Some would have come from North Africa and places. And one of the Maccabees is under an elephant, takes his sword, thrusts it through, and unfortunately the elephant falls on him and kills him. But the father and the sons are in this all-out war to preserve Judaism. I'm going to do a P13 version of something very quickly, but let me just say this without going into great detail. Because of the gymnasiums, and again, we're with the Greek culture and Greek things, and when Alexander came, he did this. The guys who exercised and worked out and were these real athletes in these Greek gymnasiums exercised without any clothes on. And so there was a procedure that if you had been circumcised as a Jew, that you could do a reverse circumcision. So when you went and worked out, you didn't stand out as being different because you were a Jew. Okay. Mentally, I can't even go there without anesthetic, and on it goes. And so when you read the books of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, one of the complaints is, we have the Sabbath day, we have worship, and then Jewish boys are then running off to the gymnasium instead of observing the Sabbath day. Well, when this Maccabean revolt breaks out, when the Maccabees capture Jewish boys, guess what's the first thing they check? Okay? And if you've had the procedure, they reverse the procedure on the spot. So this became a violent civil war. And I just promise you, if I had had that done, I'm going to die before I submit to doing that. And so this is not just a casual us against them. That was a part of it, but it's also us against us. And the struggle for the Jewish identity was very, very strong. So what is going in this? I'm under number 3, right above the dotted line. This guerrilla warfare began. Finally, the Jews are going to control Jerusalem. They're going to cleanse the temple. And notice the date, December 25th, 165 BC. This becomes known as the Feast of Dedication. So when you read in John chapter 10, Jesus is in Jerusalem. It is the Feast of Dedication. And what does John say? It's winter. Now, we also will know the feast today as Hanukkah. So it has nothing to do with Christmas, nothing to do with Santa Claus. It's a totally intertestament event that took place. And when the Maccabees are finally able to control Jerusalem, they finally are able to drive out the Greek influences, the Syrians and everyone else, then they go through this procedure and they cleanse the temple completely, the altar, take all the filth and everything else out. This whole process takes place. And so on December the 25th, 165, they control the temple again. And so, like for example, if you're in cities like Memphis and some other places, Hanukkah's a big deal in some areas where there's a lot of Jewish people. And this is where this actually comes from. So after this period of time, and this is the dotted line, sometimes from 165 to 63 is called the period of the Hasmoneans, some will translate them. And there's going to be roughly a century of self-rule. I say more or less. They're still fighting and other things. Here's one of Mr. Maccabee's son, Simon, is going to finally establish independence from the Seleucids. But probably the most dominant personality in this particular time is John Hyrcanus, and he is going to consolidate the rule of Palestine, and he and his son are also going to serve as high priest. And this is what gets tricky, because in the Old Testament it's very clear the high priests are only to come from the tribe of Levi. And then you come to a certain point in time, and especially here's where the Sadducees differ from the others. You know, if we can purchase the high priest and control that, then at least we're preserving Judaism. And so there's always some kind of struggle with this, but John Hyrcanus and his sons are king and high priest for the time that they're going to reign. But what is very interesting, and I did this out of memory, I didn't locate this, but I'm just pretty sure I read that John sent his children to Egypt to be educated. But I want you to notice their names. When you look at the Maccabees, their names are Judas, Simon, Simeon, very Jewish names. What are John's children's name? Alexander, Aristobulus, and Alexandra. Here we are trying to preserve ourselves against Judaism, and all the kids are named Greek names. So your next rulers during this time of relative independence have a very strong Greek influence. And so this is important. Look at 104 to 76. During the time that Alexander Janus controls, the Pharisees are persecuted and a number of them are killed. And I'm not talking about a few. I think at one time he crucified 800 Pharisees. Hard to imagine someone from a Jewish background crucifying Pharisees. And so during his particular reign, then the Pharisees are going to be persecuted and a number are going to be killed. When he dies, his sister Alexandra, 76 to 67, she becomes to the throne, and Sadducees are persecuted. And so it's just very odd how they would swing back and forth, and it's not a mild thing. When I'm talking about persecuting, we're talking about killing any number of them. And what is significant is this is part of how we know about the rise of the Sadducees and the Pharisees because of the records of how many of them get killed. Now, let me go ahead and anticipate and watch what's going to happen. Somewhere between, and look at the date again, 104 to 76, when the Pharisees are persecuted and killed, and the time of Jesus, they're going to do a 180-degree change. The Pharisees are going to say, let them have politics, let them have the struggle to control and to rule, and we're going to become a piety, a righteousness, a religious movement. And the Pharisees are going to totally give away all the reasons that call them to be persecuted and killed here at this time. So notice this in 63, and we mentioned this, the Roman general Pompey comes into Palestine. He comes in the guise of a peacekeeping force. There have been struggles between the successors who is going to rule, and he takes over Jerusalem and doesn't leave. And the peacekeeping force stayed there for 400 years. And so this is how the Romans then are going to be controlling Palestine. And a century later, when Jesus comes, then the Roman general comes and they take over. We mentioned this last Sunday, and let's just do it very quickly. When you go back to the Babylonians, there was a great conflict with Babylon and Egypt, and they wanted to control Palestine because that was the buffer. When you come to the Romans, Egypt is the breadbasket of the ancient world. There's mountains and snow in the southern part, even beyond Egypt. And when the snow melts, then the Nile is going to rise, and it doesn't depend upon rain. Only about 3% of Egypt is inhabitable. And if you think of the Nile, it's kind of like an interstate. It's this ribbon, this body of water that comes down, and they can irrigate off the sides of it, but only about 3% of Egypt is inhabitable. But it's not dependent upon rain because it all has to do with the snow and the other things. And so who controls Egypt can feed the Roman world. So Caesar, especially Augustus, is interested in Egypt, and he wants to control that because he can feed people who have famine in other parts of the Roman Empire. The Parthians now are in Upper Syria, and the Romans never did defeat them. So now the Romans are interested in Palestine as a buffer zone in case the Parthians come sweeping down, let them kill a few hundred Jews. And Kelly, how long is it going to take you to get Roman soldiers from Italy to Egypt in ships? So you want to have a strong military presence as a buffer zone to prevent the Parthians from taking over Egypt. And that's why Palestine, it reminds me kind of two dogs on a chain that can just nearly get to each other, and that's where Palestine is. And that's why Pilate and other people are there. But it's less about Palestine and more about the breadbasket that's down in Egypt. A person that we know a lot about in terms of just different details is Herod the Great. He's going to start ruling in 37. And if you're a ruler in one of these little countries, you're always in a hard spot because if you don't support the Romans who are closest to you, they're going to beat you up. But if the Romans who are closest to you lose, then you're in real trouble because of the other guys who won. So Antony and Cleopatra are going to recruit Herod and his group to fight with them, and they're going to be defeated in 31. Do you remember in the book of 2 Timothy where Paul says, I want you to go and get John Mark, bring him to me, he's very useful, come before winter. The shipping lanes shut down in the winter. You just virtually couldn't get a ship out because of the danger of the wind. In the dead of winter, Herod hired a ship crew, and he went straight to Augustus after he had won because he had supported the wrong side. And Herod just basically said, please do not consider whose friend I have been, Antony and Cleopatra. Consider what kind of friend I have been. Translated, I will be as loyal to you as I was to them. And so Augustus continues to allow Herod to be able to reign. I still find this statement interesting. Herod's going to become more and more unstable as time goes by. He kills his two favorite wives, probably three of his sons. And Augustus said, I would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. You would have a better chance of surviving being Herod's pig than Herod's son, and yet he left him in control. When you look at the first century, and these are just Jewish people, and we don't know these people by name, but these discussions about, oh, you have heard that it was said, Sermon on the Mount, but I say unto you. The early part of the century, Hillel and Shammai are the two leading thinkers in Jewish thought. When I was an Oklahoma Christian, Brother McCord and Brother Kelsey had these wonderful discussions about Scripture and had a lot of respect for each other. But at lectureship each year, Brother Kelsey would say, well, about 352 days a year, Brother McCord is right until lectureship comes. And here these two guys would go back and forth, and my dad loved Brother McCord because he didn't change his positions very much. He was pretty consistent. Brother Kelsey kept a list of 10 things he was always rethinking and reconsidering, but they loved each other, but they were two very unique, complementary, but they didn't always agree on everything. This is Hillel and Shammai. And I'll show you where this comes into play here in just a second. The next primary Jewish thinker is Gamaliel. And what rings the bell when you hear that? Saul, I was trained at the feet of Gamaliel. I'm in a class on Judaism in the first century, and the teacher said, for whatever it's worth, he said, I believe that Gamaliel was the brightest mind in Judaism in the first century. Okay, for those of us that are older, manual typewriter, ding, ding, and I'm thinking, okay, who did God have Paul to set with to learn the insides and out of Judaism before he becomes a Christian? It's Gamaliel. Then here's Josephus. He is Jewish. He's very important, born in 37. He is a general up in Galilee when the Roman revolt starts. He eventually surrenders to the Romans and then is virtually patronized to write. And so if you'll notice at 75, he writes the Jewish War, and it's very extensive, but we know details about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD because Josephus is an eyewitness. As far as the Jews are concerned, he will forever be a traitor. Can I say Benedict Arnold? And you understand what I'm trying to say? And so from the Jewish point of view, that one of their generals would surrender and then would write about the Roman victory is just nearly unforgivable. But that's the Jewish War. In 93, he writes Jewish Antiquities. Older is better in the ancient world. And he's going to say Moses is superior to Plato because Moses is 1,500 and Plato's down into the 300s. But again, a major work, and then he did something on his life. But here's significant, 66 to 70 is the revolt against Rome. And it began, like I said, in Upper Galilee, and the Romans gradually pushed them down into the city. I think the temple was finished somewhere between 62 to 64. We mentioned this earlier. We have at least 3 generations of people who've worked at Tinkerfield. And I've told people if Tinkerfield closes, then Midwest City becomes a ghost town. I don't know how many billions of dollars come into the Oklahoma economy because of things that are happening at Tinkerfield. And so the temple has been a place for people to work. They've had steady jobs for nearly a century. And this is a little bit sad. They get the temple finished just in time for the Romans to burn it down. And that was a contributing factor to the Civil War, to the outbreak of war, was the unemployment and the unrest that was there. Before the complete lockdown, and I'm talking about the Romans are there, Jews are in the city of Jerusalem, and a lot of fighting. Every time they have a feast or a Passover, Jews are killing Jews. But the leading Jewish thinker is Yohanan ben Zakkai, and he figures out if he stays in Jerusalem, he and those with him are going to perish. And so to be able to get out of the city, they literally build a coffin, and he pretends to die, and his disciples put Yohanan ben Zakkai in this coffin, And that way the Jews will let them take him out for the burial at that time. This will all change because before long the city's going to be locked down. And they approach the Romans and they say, our beloved rabbi has died. May we please go give him a proper burial. And so Johanan ben Zakkai literally escapes Jerusalem before it's locked down and destroyed in a coffin. They carry him out over the hill and then open the lid, and he gets out. He is then going to contact the Roman general Vespasian. He, quote, prophesies he will eventually become emperor, which he does, and he becomes the leading thinker in Judaism. But he and his disciples are out here, and they literally watch Jerusalem burn. And I just can't, Wayne, I can't imagine the heartbreak. I mean, yes, you're alive, but you just imagine being Jewish and way out here, and at least you've saved your life. But can you literally imagine the city of Jerusalem and the temple going up in flames? It would be kind of a grief beyond description. One of the disciples said to Johanan ben Zakkai, okay, we can't have Passover, we can't sacrifice, what shall we do? And just like this, he quotes and he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And from 70 AD, Judaism has moved as a ethical religious movement, and no one has been able to do the sacrifices, keep the Passover, the Day of Atonement, since 70 AD. And the entire city and the temple is going to be destroyed. There's a second war in 132 to 135, Bar Kokhba, and then in 200, something called the Mishnah begins to be collected, and we just start collecting all these different writings, and we'll talk more about that at a separate time. Let's turn the page because there's something significant I want us to look at in terms of these Jewish groups that develop in the first century. And like I said, you have so much foreign influences. You have Hellenists, you have Greeks, you're going to have Romans. And you just stop and think about even a tax collector. With the Pharisees' interest in being clean, a tax collector is permanently unclean. You got Roman soldiers around. And so what I want us to do, see the key ideas. We're going to go straight down. The Sadducees, I've never found a percentage larger than 2%. Very small, very wealthy. And they're a political party. And like I said, when I hear Sadducees, I rub my fingers together in my head and I think we're going to buy the priesthood and we're going to preserve Judaism by controlling it politically as the liaisons with the Romans. The Essenes, we're going to get away from society. Some don't think they are. I think they're probably at the Dead Sea, but they're a total separate group. And they're going to have 3 divisions of the day. And if Kelly's a part of the Essenes, then you literally work for 8 hours to help feed the commune, the group. You wash, you get clean, and then you either write and copy scripture for 8 hours, and then you're free kind of to rest and take care of yourself. But it's a very regimented, communal type thing, but we get totally away from society and the filth. The Zealots, we're going to win with the sword. We kill every time we can find a Roman by himself, we're going to take him out. And God's going to bless us if we are winning as Joshua and others did. The Pharisees, a purity, a piety movement, washing pots, washing kettles, and we'll see this. And then I have one listing, we come across the Herodians, and they just appear to be a group that supported King Herod Antipas and their friends of Rome. But here's what's interesting to me. When you look at the political views, the Sadducees would be considered liberal because they're going to support the Romans. We're going to use our funds and our money to purchase the priesthood, to purchase political influence. The Essenes, huge emphasis on light and darkness. We're waiting for a liberation, and they're not pacifists. And as we're going to see, they're probably wiped out by the Romans. The Zealots are involved in military opposition. And then the Pharisees are very conservative. We don't want anything to do with politics. We're just worried about being clean, unclean, washing pots, washing kettles, and let the Sadducees take care of all the politics. But here's the contrast. Look at the religious views. Those Sadducees who are the most liberal politically are the most conservative spiritually. We're just going to take the first 5 books, not even the rest of the Old Testament. And as Lance's grandfather taught us in Bible class, it's sad that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection or in angels. And so politically, they're going to be liberal, less buy-in influence with the Romans, and then religiously, they're more conservative. We're just going to take the first 5 books. No traditions, no washing pots, no washing kettles, and they're just totally the opposite. The Essene group, again, they're the commune. 1947 at those caves, if you come up just to the top of the Dead Sea, and then you go literally just about a mile up from the end of the Dead Sea, here were these caves, and this shepherd boy, when he threw a rock in, and he heard something break, and here these Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and a complete copy of Isaiah. Every book in the Old Testament that we have was found in fragment or some form except Esther. And every one of the rest of our Old Testament books are found in fragment in the Dead Seas. The Zealots, their heroes are Joshua and David. We're going to win with the sword. God's going to bless us when we fight the Romans. And then of all things, the Pharisees are the most liberal spiritually. We're going to take the whole law. We're going to build a fence around the law. We're going to have all of these different traditions, and we're going to be focused on purity and piety. Now, after 70 AD, I don't think very few Sadducees are going to be killed by the Romans because the Jews had killed most of them before the Romans destroyed the city. We're involved in near starvation. These are wealthy people. We're locked into the city. And so very few of the Sadducees were killed by Romans. They had already been killed by fellow Jews. And so by the time that we finish the destruction of Jerusalem, there's no more Sadducees. They are literally wiped out. When you look at the Essenes, the latest coin date at Qumran is 68. So if you find an old abandoned house and then you find American pennies, if you go look at those and find when the latest date on the penny is, that will give you a pretty good idea of either when the house was abandoned or when no one lived there. And so the latest coin that has been found at Qumran is 68, and probably the Romans wiped them out, and they hid the scrolls and hoped to come back and find them later. And it's still amazing. Here's something that is buried, left in these caves by 68 AD, and it's not found until 1947. And that's just still an amazing thing that's a part of archaeology and things. The Zealots, there are Zealots in Jerusalem. A group of them flee to Masada, which is down by the Dead Sea. It was one of Herod's fortresses. The Romans come in, and you can still see the squares where the Roman camps were. And the night before, after close to 3 years before the Romans broke through, they lined up and committed mass suicide. They killed all the women and children, and then the guys came up in groups of 10, and Kelly, you're number 10, so you kill 1 through 9. We count again, 1 through 10, you kill 1 through 9. And the next day, memory, I think there were 2 women and 3 children that were hiding in the baggage. So when the Romans finally came in and conquered Masada, they didn't get to kill any Jews because they had committed suicide the night before, and that ends the Zealot movement. So the only group that survives the fall of Jerusalem are the Pharisees. And because their leader is carried out in a coffin and he survives, then the only religious group that survives 70 AD are the Pharisees. And so they then are going to be the major competition with Christians for disciples from then on, because they're the only ones who survive. So why do we know so much about the Pharisees in Matthew and other books? Well, they're the only ones who are going to survive the first century. And after 70 AD, whatever Judaism is, it's some version of Phariseeism because all the other groups were killed. So let's do these quickly. Look at number 4. You would think there's a Pharisee around every corner. The highest percent I've been able to find is 10%. And I'll explain why. Number 2, they're very evangelistic, travel land and sea to make a convert. Number 3, they and the disciples are competing for converts of the same group. We've mentioned number 4. They have left politics. And look at number 5 right there, about 2/3 of the way down. They were into politics and they transitioned to piety. They become a religious movement. They were very much involved in party lines. And this is what's significant. Because there's so much filth, they say, we want to raise the purity regulations of the normal person to the priesthood. The priest always had a higher level of purity in the Old Testament, and I think a part of why the 90% didn't want to be Pharisees, who wants to live by the regulation of the priest if you're not a Levite? And so that's why they raised the level, because they would say of the filth and the dirt that's around them. Table fellowship, washing pots, things that are clean and unclean. And there are so much things around us, let's build a fence around the law. And that's their traditions. And so when you read through the Gospels over and over and again, the criticism of Jesus and his disciples is, why don't you keep the traditions of the elders? And that's going to come from the Pharisees trying to maintain their identity. So here's number 6, just above the dotted line. Jesus is going to focus on the outward, let's say it this way. Jesus criticized the focus on outward rules while neglecting spiritual matters. In Matthew 23, there's 7 woes. Woe unto you, woe unto you. And the Pharisees are just obsessed with the outward things that make one clean and unclean. And here we hear Jesus say, but I say to you. So here's some final thoughts. From the destruction of Jerusalem, and we're going back to 586, until the coming of Jesus, there's 5 different nations that control Palestine. So you're going to do the Babylonians, the Persians, and then the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and yes, they're both Greek, but there's 2 other nations, and then the Romans. And then here's the question, how do you maintain a belief in one God, monotheism, when you're in a polytheistic world? There's so much idolatry, so much Greek influence around you. And here's number 2. When the Romans burned down the temple in 70, then no longer are you going to make these pilgrimages back for Passover and Pentecost. And so when the temple's destroyed, then your synagogue becomes even more and more and more important. I didn't write this down, but let me just say it in a couple of sentences. From 70 AD, there is not a person alive who can keep the law of Moses as was kept in the Old Testament. Does anyone know where the Dome of the Rock is? Well, first of all, what is the Dome of the Rock? The Dome of the Rock is the second most sacred Muslim site in the world. The Dome of the Rock is built on the site of the temple. And as bold as the Israelis have been, have you noticed they haven't touched the Dome of the Rock? The whole Muslim world would stop and they would literally push them into the sea if they touched the Dome of the Rock. And how ironic, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant from 70 AD, even if you're Jewish, there's not been a temple. There's not been a Holy of Holies. And then even later, Islam comes in and builds the Dome of the Rock. And so there's not a person alive today who can keep the law of Moses, even if they wanted to. And that I find very interesting as God makes the transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. We've mentioned number 3, the diaspora, the Jews who are scattered abroad. And so here's Judaism. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night we're going to do Passover, and then the next week we're going to do Pentecost, and then we're going to do the Feast of Tabernacles, and then we'll have our Thanksgiving devotional the 4th week. But they kept a monotheistic faith with no temple. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And after the Jews come back from captivity, they're never again involved in idolatry. So they remain monotheistic. And then here's the other three things. They practice circumcision, they keep the Sabbath day, and they observe food laws. And this is the essence of the ethical nature of Judaism today. But as I've said, even if they wanted to, there is not a person alive today who can keep the law of Moses. And Paul's very specific. He who offends the law in one part is guilty of it all. And part of the amazing thing about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant is that the New Covenant's going to come into existence with the shedding of the blood of Jesus, and as we're going to see specifically, taking his blood into the Holy of Holies in heaven. And then within a few years, the temple's destroyed in 70 AD, and there's not a person alive who can keep the law of Moses as it was given in the Old Testament. And I think that's a part of God's kind of nudge and encouragement that the days are coming when I'm going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant I made with their fathers. And that's the covenant that we're a part of today. Thank you for your time. God bless.